So, let's see. Let me go quickly through to what the Sri Lanka-India case is. This is actually a picture of these two countries taken from space. And I was trying very hard to get it on the cover of this report that I am talking about, which is the India-Sri Lanka Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. See, they didn't go with me. They just came with this boring thing. I said, come on, guys, haven't you heard of the Ramayana? You know, the Monkey King comes and throws rocks across the water and jumps across it and all that. There was a bridge there. Not that, I mean, the geological data is completely contradictory to this, but who cares? This is a good story, right? So this is India, and that is Sri Lanka, and there is that little thing. Ships can't pass through, it's so shallow. There is that little thing, which you can see from space, is the connection. So there are many, many, many connections between these two countries. This is one. Buddhism, the religion that defines the culture of the Sinhalese, of whom I am one, came from India, but didn't survive in India, survived over on this side. Tamil, which is a language of the minority in Sri Lanka, is spoken on both sides, so that's Spoke Strait, about 240 million people there and about 2 to 3 million over here. We got independence just because the British, it was a collateral effect. When the Indian independence movement was successful, they said, you know, how can we look after that little island? Okay, let's give them independence. 2, we didn't have to even fight for it. It was sort of given as a byproduct of the Indian independence struggle. The Sri Lanka's Tamil militants, I think we're quite proud of the fact that we were one of the early pioneers of ethnic cleansing and suicide bombing. We introduced these concepts to the world. These people were trained, harbored, supported by the Indian government, including particularly RAW, the Research and Analysis Wing, which is the intelligence arm, and in return for which they killed former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, using suicide bombing, of course, Danu. So this is a very, very deep and complex relationship. I guess you could say that the relationship between the United States and Canada is more deep and more complex, but you know, we all have our claims to deepness and complexity. So we are very important to each other. At least they are important to us. I don't think we are important to them. So India is extremely significant for Sri Lanka. Currently, it's the largest source of foreign direct investment. It's the largest source of imports. It's not very significant in export terms, you know, less than 10%. United States is our biggest export destination. It's the second largest source of tourist arrivals, and the port of Colombo, where I have the privilege of being in a building where I just sort of see the port all the time. It's the best port, the best office that I've ever had. Even the offices that they gave me here in the classroom complex are bad compared to this one. And we do, I think, 30% of the tonnage of the containers that go through are Sri Lankan. The rest of them are Indian, mostly. So we entered into the first free trade agreement with India in 1998. It was operational in 2000. So Sri Lanka's significance to India is that that's the only free trade agreement they got. They don't like people in the SAARC region. They like us. So half of their investments are in Sri Lanka. And they, for some reason, well, Buddhism actually, they get a lot of tourists from us. And that's been the pattern of trade. The red line is India to Sri Lanka, and the black is Sri Lanka to India. That's with the trade agreement. So that's trade agreement kicks in as it goes up. As the Sri Lankan goes up, that's when the trade agreement kicks in. Prior to that is the anarchic, no rules environment. In 1991, India was almost broke, and they went in for market liberalization. We went in for market liberalization very early, but we really haven't built on it. The only reason our indicators are good are superior to that of India is simply because of the women who are educated and intelligent and who kept the birth rates down, not anything else. What we have is a country in very deep crisis. Actually, the talk that I'm giving tomorrow, I suggested to Bob that it's Sri Lanka on the road to, I like road metaphors, you can see, on the road to Somalia or to Singapore. That is for alliteration. Actually, it should be Hong Kong. Those are the two choices we got. Gateway to India in the way that Hong Kong is gateway to China, or we can implode and become a failed state. We got almost equal possibilities of going on either route at this point. So situation in 2001 was extremely bad. The economy had contracted by 1.5%, first time since independence. Tamil militants had blown up half the national fleet on the tarmac of the international airport, and the Colombo elite could no longer ignore the war. Insurance premia had war risk insurance was imposed. Basically, that crippled the export industries. Ground war was not going anywhere, and government was split. Prime Minister on one side and the President on another side. Absolute opponents. In France, they kind of make them work, but in Sri Lanka, we can't, which is why we are having another election. So part of the attempt to restore this, this guy, the new Prime Minister, with a lot of political experience, 25 years of training for the job, brought in the Norwegian mediators, signs a ceasefire with the LTTE, the Tamil armed group, invites an Indian state oil company, not a private entity, particularly a state oil company, that was a requirement, had to be government owned, and asked them to come into Trincomalee, which has the effect of separating the two parts of Tamil Eelam. And it was supposed to be the capital of Tamil Eelam anyway. And the whole idea, to put it briefly, is that if the Indians get attacked, the Indian army can land, sort of to create the conditions for an Indian invasion. So basically, the bombs stopped exploding, the buses started moving between Jaffna and Colombo, war risk insurance was removed, things got better considerably. They haven't really been, people get killed, but not on the scale that they got killed in the old days. The civil war in Sri Lanka was from the very beginning a very, very globalized war, in the sense that that same water that you saw, that was the hinterland. Boats from there would just go across. This was a revolutionary hinterland of the Tamil militants, and they would operate out of that place. 2 hours and you're here. But after the 1983 pogrom, that was when it was truly internationalized. You had hordes of refugees who had to pay mandatory or sometimes willing amounts for the LTTE, which goes into Swiss bank accounts, which goes to Thai and South African front companies, which goes to charter ships from Liberia to carry arms into Sri Lanka. A truly international war. And the response of the Prime Minister and his trusted envoy, Mr. Morogoda, the minister that I work for, was also extremely international. It was to build a safety net. Norwegians and the Scandinavians are there, there's mediation, etc. But the true safety net is the United States on one side and China and India on the other. Regional superpower, global superpower. India can spoil the game as they have in the past, while the US, of course, can squeeze the money coming in for these people, particularly after September 11th. From the very beginning, they didn't limit it to the political, as many people had tried to do in the past. From the beginning, the economic was emphasized. As I said, it is an Indian oil company that comes in for the oil tanks These were the oil tanks that were built for the Southeast Asian forces under Lord Mountbatten. This was the commanding, this is on the other side of that island. After Burma, Singapore, all these places fall, this was the center of British power during the better part of the Second World War. Those oil tanks, real crappy oil tanks, I mean, they are full of holes. You need a hell of a lot of money to restore them. So the Indians said, we are now in a liberalized country. Give us something real instead of this holy in the HOLY. Not that sense. Oil tanks. So, sort of as a byproduct, we gave them 100 gas stations in the south, and we liberalized the entire downstream petroleum market, which I'm directly involved in. That was a good move. And we got $75 million US for that too. So every time you get the political activity, you also have the economic activity coming close together. You have Assistant Secretary Roca landing in a military jet in Jaffna as a show of American military power and support. Shortly thereafter, you get Deputy Trade Representative Huntsman landing in Colombo and conducting very high-profile trade negotiations with Sri Lanka, saying, yeah, we'll give you a free trade agreement too. So it sort of goes like that. The relationship with India was very, very, well, warm. I mean, we got these guys going to India all the time, but very tense because the Indians couldn't quite stomach what had happened to them. I mean, they got beaten the crap out of by these guerrillas. They were betrayed by the Sri Lankan government. Rajiv Gandhi was killed. So difficult for them to accept it. And I talked to these people just at an interpersonal level. Very difficult for them to accept that we are doing business with the LTTE. So I believe that, now again, I don't have any first-hand information on this, but somewhere in 2003, most probably the government started, for this there is evidence, the government started public discussions and appointed committees to work on something called the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, this document. At the same time, defense negotiations started for a joint defense agreement. And again, we know we can sort of work back and say that's where it happened, because at the same time, on October 20th, when this is announced, the defense agreement is also announced. So this group, very intense work, and we were driving it without question. If it was left to them, they wouldn't have pushed it. We drove this whole process. We didn't even stay with this sort of natural protocol where you alternate the meetings in the two locations. We said, okay, next meeting, we come to India. 2 meetings in a row will come, if necessary, in order to get this thing moving, because we need this agreement. So this agreement goes through, I won't get into all that detail, but a lot of things are covered particularly on the services side. Very interesting issues where, for example, within the Indian government, some of them are talking about keeping their trade in the Indian ports, and this explicitly concedes that it would be okay to have Colombo as a transshipment point for Indian ports. It opens up the air services market, even though there were people in India, in the Indian bureaucracy, who felt that would result in a siphoning off of Indian traffic into Colombo, and they would then take other planes out. So these things were hard negotiations, but we did them. On other things, say for example mode 4, where one could argue maybe the Sri Lanka should have been scared, but we actually went beyond the conventional level of moving people associated with commercial presence. That is not very controversial, but going towards professionals delinked from commercial presence. And I don't think the Indians will actually buy that. They're not that happy about it. But the Sri Lankan president was extremely radical on that. And they said even individuals can move around and engage in services trade. Utility grids being connected together. So instead of a bridge, we are talking about a utility grid that will allow for Indian natural gas to come through, electricity to go back and forth, etc. So it's a very, very liberal document. Now, as I said, we were pushing it without question. This was done because the Sri Lankans wanted it. And it's interesting that we go back and look at the Canada-US agreement, and the evidence is quite clear. I spent one freezing January parked in Ottawa reading all kinds of documents leading up to this. Canada drove that, and the opening of the broadening it to include Mexico, Salinas drove that, not the United States. It goes against the conventional wisdom of this big, powerful country ramming free trade down other people's throats. I have some basic sort of conclusions on that. I don't think I have the time to get into great detail. This is John H. Jackson, one of the leading trade law theorists. And he basically makes this argument that where you don't have any agreement, no agreement whatsoever, that's the no rules environment prior to trade agreements. And he calls it a power-oriented regime because that allows for the great exertion of explicit power by the powerful entity. So what he says is that that is inferior to, from a fairness, etc., standards, to even a rule-based regime agreed to by unequal parties. And of course, that is inferior to a rule-based regime agreed to by equal parties or equally knowledgeable or competent parties. So just to give you a very quick run at this, this is an example that I've used in many places. Just imagine a situation where there's a schoolyard bully, because the schoolyard is a state of anarchy where there are no rules. And this bully every day randomly attacks 1 or 5 children and takes their lunch. So there are many responses that these children can have against the bully, but one response is for the 5 of them to get together and say, okay, you beat us up and take our lunch and we starve and so on and so forth. Why don't we come up with a deal? I'll give you on Monday, I'll give you on Tuesday. Very unfair arrangement. But now you have rules. And if the rules are broken, you are subject to disciplines, not only by the bully, but even by the other people, right? So that's the regime. And the bully cannot take sort of lunches of 2 people on one day. You could say this is very unfair, but it is superior to the condition of anarchy that prevailed before. Now, of course, we have to agree that it would be much better to have a situation where nobody has to donate their lunch. But that is the kind of argument that Jackson brings up. So the basic argument is that the Canadians were kind of tired of dealing with all the lumber disputes, for example, and they said, okay, give us some framework within which to work. Not that it works all the time, because you have so many exceptions, so many interpretations, and everybody plays games with these rules. But the basic idea, I mean, at least there's an explanation as to why these weak countries, Sri Lanka in relation to India, Canada in relation to the United States, etc., get into these kinds of arrangements. Now, one additional thing is that while the Canada-US agreement was a classic battle in Canadian politics, a defining battle that the Mulroney administration won by, God, some minuscule percentage vote in that election in 1988, I think. In Sri Lanka, there's absolutely no dispute on this. All sides are either quiet or supportive of the free trade agreement, because everybody thinks, the only party that might be unhappy about it might be the LTTE. Everybody else thinks that this is the way to keep the LTTE under control. So there's a huge amount of support for this thing. Of course, when you get down into it, and then some industrialists will come and want to have my head, but that's a particular phenomenon. But politically, there's no opposition to this. Now, in terms of communication, of course, the port is going to get reinforced. The airport is going to get reinforced. Already these things are happening. Without the treaties being signed, the Indian private planes have landed in Colombo. Capacity between the two countries has gone up by 100%. And I think we basically made the start on making it a air services hub. On the telecommunications side, we have given a license to VSNL Lanka, that is the Indian big international telecom operator, and I personally beat up on the incumbent to get them the necessary facilities to operate, and they are providing the connectivity for the business process outsourcing operations that are now coming into Sri Lanka. Well, the first one, not that they'll get everything, but all that is going well. However, you can see that India's international submarine capacity has been exploding given what's going on the IT side. And without question, there's no way that the Indian traffic will come to Sri Lanka and go out. Sri Lankan traffic will have to go to India. It doesn't make any economic sense with that kind of capacity explosion, going from something like 21 to about 550 gigabytes per second on undersea capacity. This is going to be an extraordinarily competitive market. So the Sri Lankans, the only thing that they wanted to protect really in this whole negotiation was agriculture, not culture. Canadians, when they went into the negotiation with NAFTA, they wanted to protect culture. That was their absolute protectable item. The Mexicans wanted to protect Petromex, the oil exploring monopoly that fed the ruling party, sort of like your crown corporations, getting fed by various entities. And the Americans, of course, wanted to prevent the Mexicans from coming into the United States. So those were their three absolute no-go negotiations. In our case, it's agriculture. We got a very inefficient agricultural industry, and we wanted to protect it. So we didn't care one bit about culture, and we sort of gave away the store on culture. One of the reasons, of course, is that we don't have the kind of problem that Canada has, which is, if you go back to Dallas's terms, the cultural screens. The Quebecois have a natural cultural screen, and they don't care much about this excitement. Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese have a natural cultural screen. Our language is not spoken anywhere else. We watch our miserable telenovelas or teledramas. I mean, they are truly miserable. I don't know why they are, but they're truly miserable. We watch them a lot. It's all about moaning and groaning and people in trouble and horrible stuff. And nobody can make that crap anywhere else in the world. So we'll watch that. We don't care about that. Now the Tamils, of course, is a very interesting story. The Tamil, there's no Tamil industry to speak of, and it'll be very interesting. There are many people who think that the LTT has got pan-Tamil ambitions, that this is not really about Sri Lanka. It's about a greater Tamil political entity, whether that will trump regionalism. And I think we are beginning to see that regionalism counts, because already the LTT has split between North and East. And East is saying, we have an identity that needs to be safeguarded.